Hey, so tonight we're diving into something that might seem quaint at first, maybe even a little silly. But trust me, when you understand the brutal reality behind it, you'll see it differently. We're talking about the penalties for breaking hearts in the 14th century. And I mean that literally. In the medieval village where reputation was currency and marriage was a contract sealed in blood and law. This wasn't romantic comedy stuff. This was serious business, and the consequences could absolutely destroy your life. So before we go any further, hit that like button if you dig historical weirdness, and subscribe if you want more stories about the times when rules were messier and stakes were higher. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because honestly, it's fascinating to see who sticks around for the weird stuff. All right, dim the lights, maybe grab some tea, and let's explore what happened when love went wrong in a time when there was nowhere to run. When we think of the medieval village, we conjure images of knights and castles, of ladies in towers waiting for rescue, of romantic gestures played out under moonlit skies. But the reality was far messier and infinitely more complicated. Marriage in the 14th century wasn't about love. It was about property, alliance, bloodlines, and survival. A betrothal wasn't just a promise between two people. It was a legal contract witnessed by the church, the village, and sometimes half the countryside. And breaking that promise, or breaking someone's heart in a way that shattered a carefully arranged union, could trigger consequences that rippled through entire families. The penalty for such infractions wasn't always imprisonment or fine, though those existed. Sometimes it was far worse. It was exile, public humiliation, forced marriage, loss of livelihood, even violence sanctioned by law. And here's the thing that really gets you when you dig into the records. The punishment depended wildly on who you were. A nobleman's son who jilted a merchant's daughter faced a very different reckoning than a peasant girl who turned down her betrothed. The village had its own unwritten codes, its own forms of justice that operated alongside the official church and crown law. Understanding these penalties means understanding how medieval people viewed promises, honor, shame, and the brittle architecture of communal trust they had to maintain just to survive. The legal framework for broken betrothals existed, though it's more confusing than you'd think. In the medieval church's eyes, a betrothal was almost as binding as marriage itself. When two people exchanged vows of consent before witnesses, they had entered into a contract. Technically, consummation could follow immediately, and in the eyes of canon law, they were essentially married. But society hadn't caught up to that religious logic. So when a betrothal was broken, the church had to get involved. Ecclesiastical courts could force a reluctant party to honor the contract. They could compel marriage. And if someone had genuinely lied or coerced the betrothal in the first place, the court could annul it. But here's where it gets complicated. The secular authorities, the Lord's court, the village council, had their own interests. They cared about property transfer, about the financial obligations spelled out in the marriage contract. If a father had promised land or goods as a daughter's dowry, and then the groom backed out, that father had lost money and status. He wanted compensation. The Lord wanted to maintain order and collect fees. The church wanted to uphold the sanctity of promises. All three systems operated simultaneously, often at cross purposes. A man who broke his betrothal might face a church court demanding he marry anyway, a secular court ordering him to pay damages, and a furious family seeking blood. The penalties weren't uniform. They weren't standardized across regions. Each village, each lord, Each bishop interpreted the law through their own lens, creating a patchwork of consequences that could range from mild to absolutely catastrophic. One diocese might treat a broken betrothal as basically a civil matter to be settled between families. Another would treat it as a grave spiritual offense requiring public penance and potential excommunication. A lord in one region might fine the offender and call it even. A lord in another might confiscate their land. The inconsistency was part of what made the system so terrifying. You didn't always know what would happen to you until it happened. Consider the case of Thomas of Yorkshire, documented in church records from 1347. He had betrothed himself to a girl named Margaret, promised marriage within a year. The betrothal was formal, witnessed, recorded. Then Thomas met Eleanor, a girl with more land attached to her family name. He decided he wanted Eleanor instead and simply refused to marry Margaret. Margaret's father went absolutely ballistic. He took Thomas to the ecclesiastical court, demanded the betrothal be enforced. The court agreed. Thomas was ordered to marry Margaret or face excommunication and a fine. But Thomas had powerful friends. He appealed to the bishop, claimed the original betrothal had been made under duress. Meanwhile, Eleanor's family was offering money to local officials to look the other way. The whole mess dragged on for years. Margaret, in the meantime, was unmarriageable. No one would touch her because she was technically betrothed to a man who was publicly rejecting her. Her reputation was shattered. She had aged out of the prime marriage market. She was also now the subject of gossip. People started asking why Thomas was so desperate to get out of the commitment. Rumors began. Maybe Margaret was barren. Maybe she had some hidden illness. Maybe she was just an unpleasant person. These rumors, entirely invented, spread through the region. Merchants' sons who might have otherwise married her suddenly weren't interested. The village was too small for secrets, and secrets too small to survive scrutiny without becoming lies. Thomas eventually got away with paying a fine and marrying Eleanor. Margaret, we learn from later records, never married. She ended up in a convent, a fate usually reserved for girls deemed unsuitable. She became Sister Margaret, spent her life in silence and prayer, and died at 63, with no record that anyone visited her. Thomas, meanwhile, had 3 children with Eleanor and prospered. He faced financial penalty, but kept his freedom and status. Margaret lost everything. This wasn't justice. This was the system working exactly as designed to protect men's interests while systematically destroying women's futures. But not all broken betrothals resulted in court cases. Sometimes they resulted in something far more immediate and brutal: mob justice. If a man publicly humiliated a girl by jilting her, if he made her into a laughingstock in the village, her male relatives might take matters into their own hands. There are records of young men being beaten, sometimes seriously injured, for abandoning their betrotheds. Not by official judgment, by the girl's father, uncles, cousins. The village would often turn a blind eye. There's this entry from a 13th century court record in Lancashire, where a man named Robert had broken his betrothal to a local girl. He showed up in the village square the following market day with 2 broken ribs and missing teeth. Nobody saw anything. Nobody reported who did it. The local bailiff investigated half-heartedly and closed the case. Robert left the village and never came back. The message was clear. You dishonor a woman in this village, you face consequences, legal or otherwise. The beating Robert received wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated messaging. Leave this girl alone, it said. Accept your broken promise. You can pay compensation or you can pay with blood. Robert chose to leave. Some men didn't have that choice because they didn't have anywhere to go. The violence, documented or not, became part of the social fabric. Everyone knew it happened. Nobody officially acknowledged it. This was the shadow legal system that operated alongside the official courts, and it was often more effective. Sometimes the social penalty was worse than anything an official court could dish out. A man who broke his word would find himself isolated. Other families wouldn't want to marry their daughters to him. Merchants wouldn't trade with his family. He'd be excluded from guild work if he was an artisan. His word would be worthless because everyone knew he'd lied when it counted. He'd become toxic, unmarriageable, unemployable. That kind of social death was sometimes more terrifying than actual exile. Exile at least gave you a chance to start over somewhere else. Social death was permanent. For women, the penalties were categorically worse. A girl who broke her betrothal faced not just legal consequences, but a complete destruction of her marriageability. In a world where a woman's value was almost entirely tied to her ability to make a good marriage, that was catastrophic. If she jilted a man, she was labeled a heartbreaker, faithless, untrustworthy. No family with any pride would marry their son to her. She'd be marked as unstable, as someone who might run away or shame the family. She'd be whispered about in churches. Mothers would point at her and tell their daughters that's what happens when you're willful, when you're disobedient. The only men willing to marry her would be the desperate or the cruel. The desperate wanted to marry down, getting a damaged girl for fewer resources. The cruel wanted a wife they could control through shame and isolation. Some girls, faced with this prospect, actually attempted suicide. We have records of a girl named Cecilia in Norfolk who drank rat poison after her betrothed spread lies about her after she rejected him. She survived, but was permanently damaged, couldn't speak properly afterward. She lived out her life in her parents' house, never married, supported as a charity case. Her breaking the betrothal had ruined her. His spreading lies about her had destroyed her. And nobody really faced consequences for that destruction because she had done the socially unacceptable thing first. She had said no. Women who survived rejection faced a specific kind of purgatory. They weren't dead, but they weren't living either. They existed in the margins of village life, perpetually tainted, perpetually marked. The penalty could also involve forced marriage to someone else. In some jurisdictions, if a girl broke a betrothal, her father had the legal right to force her to marry someone else of his choosing. Essentially, he was punishing her disobedience by marrying her off to whoever would take her, often a man substantially older, meaner, or worse off socially. This wasn't justice. It was male authority reasserting itself. It was a father saying to his daughter, "You think you can make decisions? Fine, I'll make a decision for you." The girl had thought she had agency in rejecting one man, but that agency was an illusion. She still had to marry someone. Her only choice was which man could be imposed upon her against her will. Some fathers deliberately chose the worst possible husband as punishment. A known drunk, a man with a reputation for violence, a man significantly older who would die soon and leave her widowed, which was its own kind of torture because then she'd be stuck managing his estate while his family tried to take control of it from her. Stories from the era describe girls who resisted these forced marriages, who were locked in rooms until they agreed, who were married off, and then immediately abandoned by grooms seeking revenge. One documented case from Lincolnshire involved a girl named Beatrice who rejected her betrothed. Her father, furious, married her off to a man known to be violent. The marriage lasted 3 weeks before he threw her out, claiming she was already damaged, already spoiled goods. She returned to her father's house in disgrace, and her original betrothed sued for damages, claiming he'd been dishonored by her liaison with the new husband. She was married twice, abandoned twice, and faced lawsuits from both men. She was 21 years old. The financial penalties were real and sometimes absolutely crushing. If you broke a betrothal, you might owe substantial damages. The amount varied depending on the status of the families involved and what had been promised in the betrothal contract. A nobleman's broken betrothal might result in compensation of land or goods worth a small fortune. A peasant's broken betrothal might result in a payment that could bankrupt a family. One recorded case from a manor court in 1356 involved a peasant who broke his betrothal. The court ordered him to pay 30 shillings to the girl's father as compensation. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that 30 shillings was roughly what a laborer earned in 6 months. The family had to take on debt to pay it. They lost land to cover the debt. The man who had broken the betrothal ended up essentially indentured, working off the penalty for years. His family suffered for his decision. This is the thing about financial penalties. They weren't just abstract numbers. They were concrete losses, lost fields, lost animals, lost opportunity. A peasant family that had to pay damages for a broken betrothal might lose everything they'd built. The next bad harvest could wipe them out. The irony was brutal. The son who'd broken the betrothal might survive. But his parents, his siblings, they all paid the price with him. Sometimes the whole family line suffered for one man's broken promise. Sometimes the penalty was enforced marriage. You broke your word. You were going to marry this person, whether you liked it or not. The church court would order the couple to be wed immediately. There are records of very unhappy couples being forced to the altar by ecclesiastical authorities, their faces grim, their futures bleak. One entry from 1342 describes a couple dragged to the altar by church officials, the man literally resisting, the woman weeping. The priest performed the ceremony anyway. They were married. These marriages frequently were disastrous. A man forced to marry against his will often treated his wife with coldness at best, cruelty at worst. He never forgave her, never stopped resenting the circumstances that trapped him. She lived her entire life in that resentment. No, her husband hated her simply for existing, for being the reason he was trapped. These were usually the most bitter, most broken marriages on record. There are accounts of couples forced to marry who spent decades in the same house barely speaking. Some had children together, but maintained separate lives within their own home. But the system didn't care about happiness. It cared about enforcing promises. That was all that mattered. For some people, the penalty was displacement. A man who broke his betrothal might be encouraged, sometimes forced, to leave the village. Just go. Leave and don't come back. It's not officially exile, but it functions like exile. The man loses his home, his community, his family network. He has to start over somewhere else, carrying the mark of someone who couldn't be trusted. For people whose entire world was bounded by their village or manor, this was devastating. He might try to reinvent himself in a new town, but he carried the stigma with him. Letters would travel, stories would spread. He'd be the man who broke his oath, the man who couldn't be trusted. Some men reinvented themselves successfully. Others spent the rest of their lives running from their pasts, always moving, never settling. Women didn't get this option as easily. Unmarriageable women couldn't simply leave. They depended on their families to survive. But unmarried women could sometimes find work as servants, as companions, as nurses. Some took vows and entered convents, which was a kind of socially acceptable exile. Some became the unmarried aunts who lived with relatives, always shadowed by the story of their broken betrothal. They'd be reminded of it constantly, worn down by whispers and side-eye every single day, the broken promise following them like a ghost they couldn't escape. There was also the matter of religious consequences. The church could impose penance for breaking a betrothal. You might have to confess publicly, do penance, maybe even face a lesser form of excommunication. Excommunication was terrifying. It meant you couldn't take communion. Your prayers didn't count. You were outside the community of the faithful. If you died in that state, you couldn't be buried in hallowed ground. For medieval people, that was almost worse than death itself. So the church was a powerful enforcer of betrothal promises. Priests would emphasize the sanctity of vows, the sin of breaking them, the divine consequences. They made it clear that this wasn't just a social problem, it was a spiritual crisis. People genuinely feared they might damn their souls by breaking a betrothal. Gender was everything in determining what happened to you. A nobleman's son who broke a betrothal faced social awkwardness, maybe a financial penalty, but he could usually bounce back. He could marry someone else eventually. His status protected him. A nobleman's daughter in the same situation faced a completely different reality. She faced potential violence from her betrothed or his family. She faced permanent unmarriageability. She faced being locked away or married off to someone far worse. She faced the possibility that she'd be accused of being sexually promiscuous, of using her body to escape the betrothal, regardless of whether it was true. The slander could destroy her just as thoroughly as the broken promise. Status mattered, but gender mattered more. Being a woman facing heartbreaking penalties was inherently more dangerous. There's this story, recorded in church records from 1333, about a girl named Alice who was betrothed to a man named Henry. Henry was all right, decent enough, had prospects. The marriage was arranged, practical, the kind that happened thousands of times. But then Alice met someone else, Richard. And Richard was different. He was kinder, smarter, actually listened to what she said. Somehow, impossibly, Richard loved her. Not her dowry, not her family connections. Her. They both agreed to run away together. It took planning, resources, luck. When Henry showed up at the church for the wedding, Alice was gone. Henry was humiliated. Alice's family was furious. The church was scandalized. Henry sued for damages. Alice's family paid a huge settlement and then forbade her from being mentioned by name. She was the disgraced daughter. No one spoke of her directly, as though she'd become a ghost haunting her family's history. Years later, when Richard died from plague, as so many did, Alice ended up back in her family's house, now divorced from respectability and widowed. She lived in a room at the back of the house for the rest of her life. She didn't see the great hall where the family gathered, didn't participate in village life, didn't marry again because no one would marry her. She'd broken the betrothal for love, and love had gotten her exactly nowhere. But at least the church records seem to suggest she'd had those years with Richard. At least she'd known that kind of love, even if it cost her everything else. The custom of bundling sometimes played into these situations in weird ways. In some regions, engaged couples were allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, supposedly to test compatibility and ensure they could have children. The system was supposedly monitored, though obviously not very well. If a girl bundled with her betrothed and then tried to break the engagement, the man could claim she'd already consented, already given herself to him. He could threaten to spread rumors about her chastity, destroying her reputation regardless of what had actually happened. The bundling system, which was supposed to be innocent, became a tool for coercion. In some villages, there were specific rituals for handling broken betrothals that weren't technically legal, but were absolutely enforced by custom. There's this practice in some parts of Northern Europe where a jilted bride could publicly shame her former betrothed by singing insulting songs about him in the village square on market day. She'd gather friends, and they'd sing, loudly, graphically, embarrassing him in front of everyone. It wasn't physically violent, but it was absolutely humiliating. Some men actually bought their way out of these situations, paying the girl money to not sing about them. It's almost funny until you realize how desperate both sides were. She needed some compensation for her lost marriage prospects. He needed to salvage his reputation. They negotiated his shame like a commodity. The penalties varied enormously depending on local custom. In some areas, a broken betrothal was taken incredibly seriously and punished harshly. In others, people were more pragmatic. If the match genuinely wasn't going to work, if someone had genuinely made a mistake, sometimes the community found a way to make it go away without total destruction. A new match could be arranged. Compensation could be paid. The couple could separate quietly. But this usually only happened if the families involved were willing to negotiate, if there was no pride at stake, if the jilted party was determined to fight, determined to punish. Then the system had weapons. It just depended on how much you wanted to use them. The reality is that the penalties for breaking a heart in the medieval village were brutally asymmetrical. They depended on your gender, your social class, your family's power, and your willingness to forgive. They ranged from minor financial penalties to complete social annihilation. For some people, breaking a betrothal was a minor inconvenience and a financial transaction. For others, it was the end of their life as they knew it. The medieval system didn't care about personal happiness or individual choice. It cared about enforcing contracts, maintaining honor, and preserving the social structures that held the village together. Breaking a heart wasn't a romantic tragedy. It was a breach of covenant, a failure of duty, a betrayal of the entire system that people depended on to survive. So when we look back at these penalties, we have to remember that this wasn't just about relationships. This was about property, power, honor, and the brutal enforcement of social contracts that most people couldn't afford to break. The stakes weren't just personal, they were existential, and the penalties reflected that existential weight. Looking back at all these cases, all these records, all these heartbreaking stories of people trying to exercise choice in a system that didn't permit it, one thing becomes crystal clear. The medieval village's approach to broken betrothals wasn't about justice. It was about power. Who had it, who didn't, and how they could use it to force compliance. The rich had options. They could pay their way out, marry someone else, face social awkwardness, but not ruin. The poor and the women didn't have options. They faced exile, forced marriage, public humiliation, permanent unmarriageability, or worse. The system was designed to work in the interest of property holders and patriarchs. Everyone else just had to survive within it. The penalties for breaking a heart in the 14th century village weren't just about breaking a promise to one person. They were about reinforcing the entire structure of communal control, property rights, and male authority. Breaking a betrothal threatened all of that, so the system responded with crushing force. Yet people still broke betrothals. They still chose love, chose freedom, chose to say no, even when the costs were astronomical. Some of them paid catastrophic prices. Others somehow managed to escape and build lives for themselves anyway. There's a resilience in those stories, a quiet defiance. The penalties were real, terrifying, and fundamentally unfair. But the human drive to make your own choices, to love who you wanted, to reject what was imposed upon you, was stronger. And that's actually kind of beautiful, even if the system they were fighting against was designed to crush it. These people, whose names we barely know, who left almost no records except in dusty church documents and manor court records, they dared to want something other than what was assigned to them. And some of them, against all odds, actually got away with it.